This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. In recent days, the eyes of the tech world have turned to Australia and the dispute between its government and Facebook. Following an investigation by its Competition Commission, the Federal Parliament has passed a new law which requires Google and Facebook to provide financial support to the news industry. Controversially, in the week before the law passed, Facebook, in order to try and put itself outside of the scope of these new regulations, decided to remove all news content from its site in Australia and to prevent anyone in the world sharing news from that country. In the outcry that followed, even Facebook decided they had to back down. I'm Damian, and in this podcast we'll be discussing these issues with Webster MP, member of the Australian Federal Parliament and co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Making Social Media Safe. Also Bonita Mersiades, sports writer and anti-corruption campaigner, who was formerly head of corporate and public affairs at the Football Federation of Australia, and Nguyen, policy lead at Reset Australia. We'll also be hearing from our resident expert, the disinformation analyst Charles Creel. And Webster, thank you so much for joining us here on the Infotagion podcast. It's been an extraordinary few weeks building up to the decision of Facebook to then remove news services from Facebook in Australia, and then after an agreement with the Australian government to bring them back. And the whole world has been very keenly watching what's been going on in Australia. And from your perspective in the Federal Parliament, perhaps you could tell us, what it's been like in the last 10 days in Australia, and what the reaction of people in Parliament has been to the behaviour of Facebook and its subsequent decision to back down.
Thanks very much for having me, Damian. It's great to be able to talk. It has been an extraordinary period of time, I think, for private enterprise the size of Facebook to effectively throw the toys out of the cot in the way that they did, rather than continue to negotiate at the table, really took many of us, I think probably all of us, by surprise. And eventually, through, I think, pretty good negotiating skills, I would suggest, by Josh Frydenberg, our treasurer, that they came back to the table and came to an agreement. I think that's it was. You said the other morning, actually, on our program that the world was watching, and I find that I'm very proud of Australia, actually, that we've taken the stand that we have, and have made it quite clear that representative government are the ones to determine how private enterprise will and won't operate in our country.
Absolutely. You mentioned the event which I was delighted to be invited to speak at in the Australian Parliament a few days ago, which was, perhaps you could explain for the podcast listeners a bit about it, because it was to launch a new parliamentary group of parliamentarians who are interested in reform of internet regulation.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it came out of my own experience. For your listeners who don't know, I was trolled very badly last year for months by a conspiracy theorist who dragged not just my name but my husband's name and our charity, which works with young mothers to re-engage in education, through the mud, and in the worst possible way, accusing us of being part of a pedophile network and, garnering young mothers for their children. It was just appalling. And it went on, and I had asked Facebook to take it down. We got lawyers involved straight away. It was an incredible saga to go through. Facebook were quite tardy to come to the party and to accept their responsibility to take the posts down. And that has, it's still in process, although we were awarded by the courts, obviously a win in the case, but $875,000 or something. We probably will never see it, and we're still going through the court process. So the costs for us at this stage are $160,000. So my concern in going through that process is that, what about the people who can't afford that? What about the people who are being defamed every day, being bullied and harassed and fed disinformation on a daily basis? And there is really no law that holds what I consider global publishers on social media platforms accountable as publishers. We're just not there yet. And I know there are diverse opinions even among Parliament. parliamentarians, but I believe that they should be held to account as publishers. So consequently, I decided to start the Parliamentary Friends of Making Social Media Safe with my co-chair, Sharon Claydon, the member for Newcastle. And look, within what I found very interesting, Damian, was that within 12 hours, actually not even, it was less than that, but it was during one day, we had 50 signatures of parliamentarians to sign up, and we're now at 75, which is actually one of the largest parliamentarian friendship groups that we have. So I'm quite dedicated to how do we move forward here, how do we influence ministers, how do we get this conversation out in the public arena.
That's great. I think so much support is built up so quickly. I mean, do you think that it's a combination both of people's own personal experiences and therefore frustrations, particularly in your case, which would seem like a really cut and dried case where Facebook should have done more quicker and been more cooperative? Do you think there are other people that have similar problems and therefore can see clearly for themselves what the issues are, combined, of course, with this big row the Australian government has now had with Facebook?
Yeah, look, I think people, certainly politicians, are very used to, I would say, sadly, the kind of trolling that is offensive at best and defamatory at worst online. And I think, the Twitter sphere is an appalling, I don't know, I think there are all kinds of terrible names for it that probably describe it much better than Twitter sphere. But, MPs are well aware of it. I think there are plenty of MPs, including Sharon Claydon, who is really aware of the dangers for young people and for victims of domestic violence who are coercively followed and managed. Their lives are managed on social media platforms as well. So it's a broad space with a lot of interest in how do we do this better.
And with the decision of the Australian government to sort of create this new law, this new news code, to me, and enforce it and make very clear they were determined to enforce it, which would have given the government the power to designate a social media company and require them to have a deal in place to remunerate news providers, and if they failed, to have an independent body that could arbitrate in that situation. To me, that really demonstrates that if a government and a parliament are prepared to stick to their guns, that ultimately the tech companies have to fall in line. They have to obey the laws of the countries where they do business. And I think for me, that's a kind of really positive lesson of what's happened in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm just really proud of our government. I think it's just one of the landmark achievements that will change people's lives, certainly will change news providers. It will provide revenue appropriately to quality news outlets, and that's appropriate. Google and Facebook should not be able to benefit in the way that they have for so long without any questions attached and without any price attached for the benefit of their services.
And what do you think from your position as a parliamentarian? What did you feel the public reaction was to Australia removing news from its service? When I first heard the news, I tried to share an article from the Sydney Morning Herald about that, what had actually happened, and instantly discovered how effective Facebook's blocking techniques were. And what do you feel public reaction was?
Public reaction, people were outraged. Some, interestingly, and you're an MP, so some, interestingly, were mad at the government. How dare they do this to their source of news? Because some people, of course, 30%, I think, in Australia rely on or have relied on Facebook for their news source. So, they were outraged that the government would dare to stand up to Facebook. But there were many that were wondering and I think worried that it would end badly. But I think, I'm just really pleased that it's taken place. I'm pleased that we have the leaders that we have who've, been able to stand buff and stand against the kind of bullying tactics really that we've seen.
I mean, the new law was based on the back of a really excellent report, I thought, by the Australian Competition Commissioner, looking at the domination of Google and Facebook of the ad market, and the fact they control 80% of the ad market in Australia, and the ad revenues for newspapers have fallen by 50% since 2006, which are very stark figures. I mean, do you think what's been done is going to be enough, or do you think some of these problems will endure?
Look, I'm sure some of the problems will endure, because no matter what solution you bring to the table, it's not going to be perfect. But, I'm learning in this role that don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. And I think this is a really good transformation and good implementation. And it will be very interesting to see how things pan out. I'm from a regional electorate, so I have 82,000 square kilometres in my electorate, with many small regional newspaper outlets. And so I'm concerned that they don't miss out, So that's part of that good and perfect deal. I just want to make sure that they benefit from this as well.
I'd like to bring Bonita into the conversation. Before I do that, and I just wanted to ask on the content moderation side, because I think this intervention around supporting sustainable news and trying to correct market domination in the ad market is really important, and it's something in the UK that we're looking at, and in the European Union they're looking at as well. But another part of the debate we're having in Westminster is around sort of content moderation and in making sure companies are more effective at removing harmful content, the sort of content that you were a victim of yourself. And is that something that in the Australian Parliament you're discussing as well, whether there should be additional regulations around setting standards to make sure that harmful content is removed, and also that social media companies don't boost and recommend and promote harmful content on their sites?
Yes, with helpful algorithms. Look, it's really interesting you asked me that, because one of the senior politicians, parliamentarians, asked me yesterday to meet with him to talk about this very issue and how we could move on it going forward. And backtracking for a second, I'm part of the Standing Committee for Social Policy Legal Affairs, and we spoke with I'm not sure which department, sorry, I'm vague, but about this, the gambling and online adult content, and managing that through facial recognition and other means, which I'm sure you could tell me about. And apparently some of that implementation or presentation to Parliament didn't go ahead prior to the last election, because it was a bit of a hot topic. So I'd certainly like to hear what you're up to in that. But for us, one of the things I said to this MP yesterday was, if we want to drive a car, we have to get a license, and we get the maps for the roads, and we do all of those things going forward. And the right to drive on the road is on the basis that you have a license, well, preferably, And when we have an Apple phone, for example, we provide a tremendous amount of data to ID information to Apple in order to link up our phones. Why is it that we want to control sites and information coming in when our identity potentially could be managed right at the outset with the owner of the phone? I don't know whether that's clear, but I think I think it's something worth thinking about, and he hadn't thought about it. So I don't know what your thoughts are. I'd be interested.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And in some ways, it cuts to the heart of a tussle between Apple and Facebook at the moment, where actually you could, in terms of data gathering, exploiting users' data, if you could control that at device level, so that you
exactly.
Yeah, and Apple do want to give people more settings there to limit the amount of data that is shared from their device. You won't be surprised to know Facebook is very against this idea, but it also shows that actually when we talk about technology companies, they're not all the same. They have quite different business models, and some of them are much better on things like privacy. Companies like Facebook are very data acquisitive, because that's how they make their money. But I think controls at device level would certainly be one of the ways you could enforce people's data rights more effectively.
Yes. Our conversation was sorry, go on. Our conversation was around 15-year-olds, managing that kind of content access for 15-year-olds and under, so the M15 plus. I'm not sure what your standards are age-wise, but ours is M15 plus, and he was thinking, we should be able to control it from the platform point of view. But I think that, as you say, the device entrance potentially could be the place. The problem is kids use their parents' phones. That's the problem with that.
Yeah, there is that problem. So we have this piece of legislation we've already passed, called the Age Appropriate Design Code, which sets different rules for how online tools and social media tools can be designed for younger people to use them, and that can include the way in which data is gathered about their activity, the sort of advertising is targeted at them. It can also include the design of products. So if you take a product like Snapchat, it has this function on it called Streaks, which rewards you for revisiting every day, but you can't opt out of that particular function. It's designed to make it even more addictive, and young people in particular feel that they're breaking friendship groups if they don't constantly return to that feature. So I think it's looked at things like that to say these could be inappropriate. But I think it also, quite importantly, needs to look at things like, does the Instagram algorithm recommend harmful content to teenage girls, for example, and how?
Exactly.
What action can we take to stop that?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
But it's a big area of debate. But I think the really exciting thing now is, I think, is around the world. I think there's a recognition that the tech companies, in part, have created these problems. They don't necessarily have the solutions in place to fix them, and it requires now, just as we've done in other industries over the years, some external standards to be set by parliaments that regulators can enforce.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think we've now, if you like, broken the ice on how that might happen. And I'm really interested to see what the rest of the world does, what the UK does.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to staying in touch on this, Anne. It's been really great to have this chat with you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed it. Thanks, Damian.
Thank you. Bonita, it's great to have the chance to speak to you about these few days in Australia from a slightly different perspective. For the benefit of people listening to the podcast, I've known Bonita for a number of years. Initially, when we worked together on a campaign called New FIFA Now to reform the governing body of world football, which was successful in part, and that a lot of the corrupt people are now left. But like many institutions, there's still a lot more to do. But today I wanted to ask you, Bonita, about a different organisation beginning with F, and that's Facebook. Because, I mean, as well as your role as in football in Australia and as a commentator known around the world on sports corruption issues, you've also worked as a journalist. And from a sort of citizen's perspective, what was your experience of Facebook shutting down news in Australia?
Well, we woke up on the morning that it happened to find that not only had all the big media companies such as Fairfax, the ABC, News Limited had been banned, but so had all the little people. But it went further than that. It wasn't just community newspapers and football websites and that sort of thing. It also included businesses. It included some charities. It included other campaign groups. For instance, aged care is a very big issue in Australia at the moment, and there's an aged care campaign running in relation to a royal commission that's about to be report that's about to be handed down, and that went off. So it was virtually almost everything. Even someone I know who lives up in far north Queensland in Cairns and runs a football training academy, their site was not able to was taken down as well. So they certainly made a mistake in their algorithm when they did that. And I think the reaction, it really depends on where you come from on these issues. I think, as Anne was saying, there was a lot of people who were outraged with Facebook. There were some people who were outraged with the government, as always happens. But I think also it's probably pie in the sky, but it also gives us an opportunity to pause and look at the bigger issue, which is why are so many people and organisations so reliant on Facebook?
I think that's right, and it's and I think it's one of the ways in which it makes abuse of its market position possible, because people may be angry about some of the things they see on Facebook and think, well, why aren't they more effective at dealing with it? Or they might think, if you're in the advertising business trying to buy space, you might think, well, why are they so dominant? But what can you do other than leave Facebook, which may be very hard if everyone you deal with or your business is reliant on Facebook.
Yeah, it is, and you go to any small business and they will all be on Facebook, even if they don't have a website or any other sort of funding for marketing or promotion or anything like that. They've got Facebook. So you can understand why people are more or less forced to be on it. But it's a great pity when you consider that people are so reliant on it and have it open on their device all day that every single bit of information they want comes through that particular app comes through Facebook. And so therefore, as I said, it's probably pie in the sky and it's not something that anyone can address, but it's almost become bit too big to fail, Facebook, because it just handles everything that we manage. But I know, as someone who is involved in both business as well as charity groups as well as campaign groups, I wish none of those things had to have a presence on Facebook, because I have a basic philosophical problem with the way Facebook was established in the first place, and that was on the basis of somewhat sexist and misogynistic reasons. It was about ranking women who were at Harvard. It wasn't about any sort of way of helping people communicate with each other. And I think some of the business decisions and some of the policy decisions that you see come out of them now perhaps reflects that background in the first place.
Yeah, I think when my dealings with Facebook and speaking to other people, and indeed people like Anne just now, you have a very strong sense that they see the world their way, and they're sometimes blind to the harm, I think, that can be caused by the tools they've created and the way other people use them. And there's frustration that they don't take responsibility quickly enough when things go wrong.
No, absolutely not. As is the same with many large organisations. I mean, you could say the same for some traditional media organisations who have used their market power in that way as well. And part of what Anne didn't say, and the alternative debate in Australia is about, there. Of course, the big media companies are all in favour of what the government's doing because A, it is giving them a revenue stream. And B, it's standing up for them. But the alternative view is the one that Facebook puts forward, which is that, well, you don't have to come to Facebook to read that bit of media. And that's absolutely right, which gets back to the all-pervasiveness of how we acquire our information. And because there is no journalistic management or control or editorial control on what comes through a Facebook feed, you do get the outstanding publications, whether it be the New York Times or the Fairfax media here in Australia, or whether it be all sorts of misinformation that goes through. Because what Facebook is almost like the giant back fence that we have, and the whole world can talk to one another, and it doesn't really matter what the information is. It's just a whole lot of people exchanging views, and there's no curation, I guess, of those views or what's put forward.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, there's one of the, I think, challenges that come with Facebook's business model is that it's designed around engagement. So it wants to engage people for as long as possible, because the longer you're on Facebook, the more money Facebook can make by running ads at you, targeted at you, and it targets them based on the data it's taken from you and kept from you about what you're interested in and what's likely to keep you on the site for longer still. Now, the problem with that is that if you're blind to what that content is that will keep you engaged, then that can mean you direct people to more extreme content that can be harmful. And there have been studies showing that Facebook does in fact direct people towards extremist content, and there are many journalists who do deep dives into Facebook looking at conspiracy theories around things like coronavirus who will attest that once you start engaging with conspiracy theories of one sort, you tend to see a lot more. So I think it's right we question whether a model like that is ethical and right, and therefore if we think it's not, and that model could be causing a great deal of harm in society, that what do we do about it? And I think that's when you come back to the position of saying, well, in other industries in the past, what we've done is we've established regulators because we recognise that these businesses have become almost like core utilities in our daily lives. There's a value in continuing to use them, but we also need to establish proper rules of the road for how they operate themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't matter what the industry is. As you said, if it's a big one, there's regulation around it. And we just, those who want to operate in that market, in that industry, need to get used to being regulated. So, and as I said earlier, it's almost, one part of me wishes that Facebook wasn't around. A big part of me wishes that Facebook wasn't around at all, but it is, and we have to live with it, and therefore it has to be managed as well as possible. So regulation and the tack that the government is taking is, on balance, probably the best way. Having said that, as I said, the countervailing view is that, of course, big media here in this country is applauding it because it's giving them something that they didn't already have. And let's be clear about, things. And I say this as part of, being involved with charities and campaigns and business. When they talk about advertising revenue going down in traditional media, it's because it's a lot more expensive and they don't have the capacity to target as Facebook do. So it is, partly they've been hoisted by their own petard in that they haven't been innovative enough over decades. And partly it's because you've got Facebook, which is so large and it's got so much deep pockets that they've able to almost lead in innovation and be able to deliver at fairly effective advertising quite cheaply. So, as a small business person, you can spend $10 and say, I want to target, a football fan who lives in Sydney, who lives north of the harbour and is aged between 18 and 25. That's really fantastic when that works well, and Facebook does get those things right.
I'm glad you brought up football, because I want to ask your views on Facebook within a sort of sporting context. It's something that in the UK we've been talking about recently, is the way in which social media, not just Facebook, but Twitter and other services as well, have been used to target players in particular. There's been a lot of racial abuse of footballers in the UK on social media recently. And I think a feeling that something needs to be done about this, because it's normalising hate speech, and it's not right that people should be targeted in that way. And I wondered if that was something that in Australia that people have seen as well, of sports stars and other public figures receiving regular abuse on social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And Anne was talking earlier about how politicians are trolled. She needs to look at other people. I think basically if someone has an opinion or has a bit of a public profile, they get trolled. And that's what social media, whether it be Twitter or Facebook or whatever, has allowed people to do. Particularly Twitter, because it allows people to be anonymous. And of course, Facebook, you can have a fake Facebook profile as well. And some of the way some, as you talked about football players, I mean, some of the things that are said and done to football players, male and female, or other sports people, is just disgraceful. And the social media platforms have taken too long to act on it, if at all. And I guess the former US president was a really good example of that. But the same is with sport, and we certainly do see it. It concerns a lot of people, but it doesn't seem to sort of shift them in any way in terms of taking action against it. So while we all sort of sign up to terms and conditions, they're not necessarily dealt with very favourably or very well. Having said that, I have been, as you know, Damian, had fake Twitter accounts set up in my name, fake Facebook accounts, fake LinkedIn accounts, fake Bitcoin accounts, all through part of the FIFA campaigning and football campaigning that we did. And I must give credit where credit's due. Both Twitter and Facebook were very quick to deal with it. And once they are able to verify your identity, they put a lot of safeguards around it. So in that respect, if you do go to them and if you can get their attention, they will act pretty promptly on it.
Well, that's good to hear in that case, absolutely. I mean, one of the things we've talked about on the podcast before, and it's certainly been an issue around sports, is sports and competition can there are two teams. It can get people can get very excited about their team, and social media often likes issues where there's division and separation, which provokes a debate. And we've seen in Europe in particular, and I've also heard about this campaigns like this being directed from the Middle East, that football groups and football chat forums on social media, sort of football groups on Facebook, that are set up principally to talk about sports, suddenly then pivot to talk about political issues and other issues, and they'll probably set up to draw people in who are interested in football, and then to sort of use those forums to push other ideas at them, some of which could be radicalizing or conspiracy theories or or certainly very politically partisan. And I don't know whether that's anything that you've come across in your work looking at sport in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly there. You notice it a lot in football, and in particular, it nearly always comes from people who have, on Twitter in particular, who have anonymous profiles, no photo, just some sort of generic image, and have some made-up name or some nonsense name. But they're quite effective in getting traction and getting followers, and they know how to use a hashtag, and they get noticed. And absolutely, that happens. It could start off as an innocent conversation about whether the goal was offside or not, and it can end up with something quite disturbing about whether it be sexist or whether it be racist or in all sorts of other things. And I've certainly seen that. And for that reason, I think a lot of people, I know from my own experience, I'm on social media platforms simply because I'm involved in these external things that are of interest to me, including business interests. But if I was retired and if I was lying in the sun somewhere and not having to do anything, I wouldn't be on any of them because they're just unpleasant. And there's just, they can be very, very powerful when used for good and used to genuinely inform people about something. But they can also be so negative, and it's just not worth the emotional energy that it takes to sort of put up and read this stuff. As Anne alluded to, when you're trolled time after time after time, it is debilitating after a while. And you think it's easy for people who haven't been trolled to say, "Oh, just don't look at it." That's easy to say. It's not always easy to take notice of.
I think that's right. And also, you think you get a feeling, well, why should it's not me, the user, who's created this system. I'm just on it. And, why should it just be down to me to regulate it? Why can't the platforms do better at regulating it themselves? They're the ones that have created these systems. But just before we close, I mean, do you think that, the events of the last couple of weeks in Australia will lead many people to sort of think, well, actually the time has come to do something about these things, and we're seeing in one area how intervention by the government can lead the companies to change their ways, but actually there are more fundamental problems that need to be addressed now, and now's the time to do it.
I think there is an appetite for that. I think there is a generally better understanding that something needs to be done to regulate how social media is consumed. Or not so much consumed, but delivered to us. There is, as I said and as Anne said, there are a proportion of people who don't quite, in my opinion, don't quite understand where that responsibility lies. But I think overall the government has got, and the ACCC, as you said, Rod Sims from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, has got the right approach on this. Whether it needs a little bit of finessing here and there, absolutely, it probably does. But I think that most people are behind the government in what they're doing, and they see Facebook as being big bullies.
Absolutely. Bonita, thanks so much for joining us.
That's a pleasure. Thank you, Damian.
Matt, it's great to have you with us on the podcast as well. We've heard Anne talking about the feelings in the Australian Parliament about tech companies, and how I think this has been seen as a really significant moment when the government of Australia and Parliament has demonstrated it's prepared to stand up to them. Where do you think this takes us in terms of tech policy in Australia?
Yeah, so I think it's been a long and protracted battle, and it should signal to the rest of the world that there are things that governments can do to try and rein in some of big tech's influence. I think the next 12 months will be critical to see how this code is used, if it gets triggered, and if it actually has an impact on increasing a pluralistic, robust and sustainable journalism sector in Australia. I guess that's the main goal of this all going through. But yeah, I guess it's a bit of a wait and see game at the moment. I think it's a good first step, but it shouldn't be the last legislative intervention that our government does to ensure a good journalism sector.
As you say, if it's triggered, because it seems to me that in some ways this is a sort of a mechanism the Australian government can use if Google and Facebook fail to agree good deals with the publishers that the publishers are happy with. They can then go down this route, but if those deals have been put in place, they don't necessarily have to.
Yeah, exactly. There were some amendments made, I guess, at the 11th hour this week before it was passed, kind of at the incredible display of market power that Facebook did by shutting off news on their platform to Australians. And some of these amendments have, I guess, unknown implications to the effectiveness of the code. So the two main ones there are the treasurer, who gets to decide which digital platform gets designated by this code, has to take into account if Facebook or Google, quote unquote, contribute to a sustainable journalism sector. So there's room for argument there. And then the second amendment, which has unknown implications as well, is if if a platform and a publisher make a deal outside of this code, they aren't eligible for this non-differentiation clause, which basically enables Facebook and Google to prioritize their content or whatever. But the implications of those two amendments made this week, like the proof's in the pudding, I guess, and we'll see what happens in the next few months if they're triggered.
Now, it's interesting that you talk about the news publishers as a group and the way the code works for them. We're having this debate in the UK in the context of the Online Harms Bill about what a news provider constitutes, because there are some organisations that are really disinformation networks that claim to be news organisations, and yet we're all familiar with the major news brands. In the UK for online harms, there's an exemption from the bill for news organisations, but the government's not yet come up with a definition of what a news organisation is, and how's that been handled in Australia?
Yeah, so through this code, the government's put in three criteria for what a news organisation is. One is if they produce core news content, so that's stuff like social issues, politics, that kind of stuff. The second one is if they have a revenue over $150,000 a year. And then the second one is if they are registered with like a legitimate body, so like the Australian Press Council or something like that. And so, yeah, for the UK context especially, I think points 2 and 3 could be interesting. But I guess the big flare point for us here is that, was that $150,000 limit the right amount? Does that discriminate against smaller independent startup news companies or not? And so that was the main point of debate here.
I think sometimes in politics we reach these points where an issue, if you like, becomes much more mainstream, where more parliamentarians are engaged with it, more citizens are engaged about it. And I wonder if this week in Australia has become one of those moments where the questions about the responsibilities of companies like Google and Facebook, the right of Parliament to legislate in the public interest, is now seen as being sort of more critical. And I'd be interested in your views on that, and if you think there has been a sort of anger from the Australian people about what's happened in the last week that they won't forget.
Yeah, definitely. I think I really hope that this provides the launch pad for Australians to have a conversation of if we're okay with these monopolies based out of Silicon Valley dictating how we consume information. I think it's actually crazy that, and we shouldn't forget this for a long time, that in the middle of a pandemic, I think like on the day or the day before our vaccine rollout was supposed to happen, Facebook pulls news from our country, basically saying to Australians that they don't deserve credible and reliable and timely information in like an unprecedented global disaster. So I think I don't know, like we've all heard Facebook saying we're not the arbiters of truth. We couldn't possibly moderate content or disinformation or hate speech and stuff. And then they really showed their hand by by doing just that, being like, oh, actually, if it hurts our bottom line, if it forces us to share our data or negotiate, we will be the arbiters of truth. So yeah, I'm excited for what this means for like the everyday Australian to come to terms with where that we're beholden to these companies, and hopefully that spurs some public and parliamentary action.
That's great. I hope you're right. And it's been a week where we've been following events in Australia very closely, and the whole world's been watching. And Matt, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Charles, it's great to have you with us as always. You heard me discussing with Anne Webster the struggle between Facebook and Apple over data privacy, and I know this is an issue you've been taking a keen interest in as well.
Thanks, Damian. A few weeks back, we talked about how Facebook was about to launch an antitrust lawsuit against Apple. They were claiming that Apple's moves to introduce new privacy requirements for app developers were anti-competitive, which is something that I wouldn't agree with at all. Briefly, Apple is introducing a new feature called App Tracking Transparency, or ATT. It'll come in early spring, and what it requires is that a user give a company direct permission before that company can track the user's movements around the web. That's outside of Facebook, around the web. All of this sounds reasonable, and it certainly fits with Apple's ongoing efforts to position itself as the protector of digital privacy. Upholding a greater good is what the Wall Street Journal called it, while they're leveling criticisms at Facebook's business model, sometimes naming the social media giant, and sometimes Apple demurs. But this isn't really new. Tensions between the two companies have been around for a long time, but they've really heated up to an extraordinary level recently, with Zuckerberg telling his team in a recent call that they, quote, needed to inflict pain on Apple. Now, how deep does this animosity go? Well, Cook and Zuckerberg have been busting on each other for a few years. In 2018, and that's in the midst of the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, which was largely made public by the DCMS Select Committee, Tim Cook was asked how he would lead Apple through a similar crisis. And Cook shot back that Apple wouldn't find itself in a similar crisis. And that was a direct hit at Zuckerberg. The Facebook founder called the comment glib, which was a bit wan considering reports that he also became so enraged that he personally instructed his own executives to stop using iPhones in favor of Android devices. And Facebook later confirmed that this was true in a press release. Now, last month, during the company's earnings call, Zuckerberg called Apple an increasingly bigger threat to Facebook, and he said Apple was interfering with how Facebook operates its apps. And Cook has responded to that with a condemnation of Facebook, saying that their business model led to public division and violence. And he went on in that speech to accuse Facebook's algorithms of spreading conspiracy theories and amplifying the January 6th U.S. insurrection. All of these things that we seem to confirm on a week-by-week basis here on Infotagion. Now, the back and forth has gone deeper, featuring full-page ads in the New York Times, complex reports from Facebook, and a pending antitrust lawsuit. But now that Zuckerberg openly stated to his employees that Facebook needs to inflict pain on Apple, it's easy to see how personal this has turned, and at least for one of the players. And that player just happens to be the only one of the two that 68% of his shareholders have voted for him to step down as board chair. And back to you, Damian.
Charles, thanks so much for that. It's been great to have you on the podcast as usual. And Anne, Bonita, and Matt, thanks for joining us too. You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Anne Webster, Bonita Mersiades, Matt Nguyen, and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also support this show by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Infotagion podcast. Infotagion is a not-for-profit organisation, and all proceeds will go towards the making of this podcast. Thank you. Until next time.